Some time ago, I did a presentation on the formation of Indian civilization, primarily focusing on the 3 to 4 thousand years of Neolithic development and the formation of agricultural societies from around 7000 BC to about 3000 BC, after which civilization, in a sense, accelerated into its Harappan phase. Now, in that presentation, I had primarily focused on the northwestern region where the Harappan civilization developed. But in recent decades, we are getting a much more complex picture of how civilization developed in this greater Indian subcontinental zone. Now, to begin with, it is important to understand that while this northwestern domain remains the most important agricultural center, in fact, even within this northwestern domain, we can identify three separate zones where agricultural civilization or agricultural societies might have developed. This includes the central arc centered around Mehergarh, which is one of the oldest sites at around 7000 BC. Simultaneously, there is another site just to the east of Mehergarh in the north-central region around the Indo-Gangetic plains at the site of Kunal, which is perhaps also as old as Mehergarh. So this is the central arc, but in addition to this, we have a northern center centered around Kashmir, where agricultural society developed, and we have a southern center centered around the Gujarat Peninsula, where again there was a pre-Harappan phase of agricultural development. Now this Gujarat Peninsula phase began from about 3500 BC and might have been influenced by societies in the southern Indus region. But this again is the mega cluster in a sense of agricultural development. But in addition to this, we have four more cultural zones where agricultural society also developed, more or less independently of each other. Now, this includes the Gangetic cluster, and here we have again two zones, a northern Gangetic cluster and an eastern zone where civilization developed, perhaps again independently. And interestingly, this northern Gangetic zone, or the central Gangetic zone, in fact, we find sites dating to about 8000 BC when settlement first began, but regularized agriculture-based societies only began to take shape from about 3000 BC. Now, these societies were capable of agriculture because we have some evidence that around 7000 BC, some agriculture might have been practiced here. In fact, rice might have been cultivated here. But because of the abundance of other resources in the region, where food could easily be harvested from forests, perhaps regularized agriculture wasn't as much of a necessity. So in addition to this, we have what is now called the Eastern Zone, which again might have maintained intermittent connections with this central Gangetic zone. And finally, we have the South Indian Neolithic, which is also important, and here we find sites which go back to about 3000 BC, and in many cases even older. So after this broad introduction, now let me discuss all these sites and different clusters in a little bit of detail to give you a sense of how agricultural society developed. Now I have discussed the long march to the mature Harappan phase, the 3000-year prelude in a sense to the development of the mature Indus Valley civilization in my previous presentation, so here I will focus on the other domains. Just to give you a broad idea, the oldest agricultural site relating to what became the Indus Valley civilization that we have found is Mehergarh, located here. But simultaneously, there is another equally important site in Kunal. So this forms the central axis around which various crops such as wheat, barley, and cotton, among others, were cultivated. Oilseeds were an important component of agriculture here. And gradually, animals were domesticated. The zebu cattle, which became an important marker of the Indus Valley civilization, perhaps also goat and sheep, and various other sophisticated forms of settlement such as the development of granaries and the development of distribution mechanisms were all developed. But also importantly, there was a northern Neolithic, and this northern Neolithic was located in the Kashmir and the Swat Valley. And here we find signs of occupation from the later 4th millennium BC. Now, culturally, these people were distinct from the Harappans of the middle settlement zone. They lived in very different kinds of houses. They built their houses underground. And while they might have borrowed some cultivated crops from the pre-Harappans of the Middle Indus Valley, they also interacted interestingly with other cultural zones developing, especially in northern China. And in fact, we find remains of stone harvesting tools and some other cultural elements which seem to link these people, perhaps with the people who were also forming civilizational zones, early civilizational zones in northern China. So this forms an interesting component or a land bridge in a sense between these two wider cultural arcs and gives us hints that there might have been interactions between these early Neolithic cultures in India and in northern China. So again, this is an important region which needs to be taken into account when we consider the development of Indian civilization. And of course, the diffusion of civilization between the Chinese cultural sphere and the Sino-Tibetan cultural sphere in a sense, and the early Indus Valley cultural sphere. Remember, civilization in the Middle Indus zone is developing from around 7000 BC, and this regional phase takes off from around 3500 BC. But by about 3000 BC or slightly later, by about 2700 to 2500 BC, this zone is also integrated into the wider Indus zone. But there is a 1000-year prelude in which there is cultural diffusion between the Indus region and perhaps the Sino-Tibetan region, which is vital for understanding that civilizational development anywhere does not happen in isolation. And after this, of course, we move to the Ganges Valley Neolithic or the Middle Ganga Neolithic. And this region also is an early center of domestication of both crops such as rice, millets, and slightly later pulses and other important winter crops. It might have borrowed some crops such as wheat and barley and perhaps lentils from the west, which again shows us that there might have been early interaction. Now, interestingly, the oldest sites in this region date to about 8000 or 7000 BC. At this time, some of these societies were capable of practicing agriculture. They were capable of cultivating rice. We have some evidence of that. But at some point, they chose to give up agriculture, perhaps because food or other sources of nourishment from the waters of the river and perhaps also from the forest were widely abundant. So agriculture, which is back-breaking work, was perhaps not necessary for these people to sustain themselves till population density became a problem and agriculture was then required. So from about 2000 BC, we begin to get evidence of regularized agriculture being practiced here. The earliest phases, of course, shows rice cultivation, and this perhaps is an independent zone of rice cultivation, which is also being cultivated simultaneously in Southeast Asia. Now, was there some interaction between the Southeast Asian cultural zone and this Gangetic cultural zone? We have the beginnings of evidence for this, but at the moment, this is all very conjectural. Again, there is an interesting element in these societies. We find a tradition in the region of what we might call hunter-gatherer fishers. So these are hunter-gatherers in the traditional sense, but they also maintain ponds where they raise fish stock to supplement their nutrition. And this again shows that agriculture of crops is not necessary when other sources of nutrition are available. Remember, agriculture and farming is back-breaking work compared to, say, harvesting fish from wet water conditions or perhaps then hunting big game. And until you reach a condition where you have population density which cannot be supported by your ecological zone, until then perhaps agriculture is not required. So let us move now to the next agricultural zone and the next Neolithic zone. And this is what is called the Eastern Neolithic in eastern India in the state of Orissa and centered around the Mahanadi River Valley. And here we have sites like Golbai Sasan, Gopalpur, and a few others, which were established around the end of the 3rd millennium BC. And these sites possibly show an expansion of population from other cultural zones here, and these people who moved into the zone settled here for the purposes of agriculture. And again, we have evidence for the cultivation of rice from about 1500 BC, and the cultivation of some native species of pulses, which again are also found in other zones from this time period onwards. So perhaps there were people who came into this region and they settled here. They domesticated these crops, and later these crops were circulated around the wider region of the Indian subcontinent. So now we move to the west, and this is what is called the pre-Harappan Western Indian Neolithic zone. This is centered around the region of Gujarat, which would later be incorporated into the Harappan sphere. And here we have evidence for cultivation dating to about 3500 BC to 2500 BC. Millets were cultivated here. We also find evidence for the domestication of sheep and goat, which might have arrived here again from the Indus Valley region. And we also find cultivation of millets here. And in fact, millets might have first been domesticated here before being passed on to the Indus Valley region. But here is something interesting. From about 2000 or 1700 BC, in the later phases of the Indus Valley civilization, as civilization in the core zones or the core arc, the middle arc of the Indus Valley began to decline, civilization here saw an expansion. And simultaneously, there was an introduction of crops from Africa. So we have crops such as sorghum, pearl millet, and finger millet. And according to most scholars, these crops arrived from Africa. So this might show that there were perhaps indirect links between this region and Africa, perhaps the Egyptian civilization, via, of course, Arabia at this point of time. Again, this is an emerging field of research, and who knows, perhaps there were even direct links of some kind. After all, the code of the monsoon had been cracked, and traveling along the coasts of the Arabian Peninsula might have linked these people upwards towards people perhaps around the Horn of Africa who were also trading at this point of time all across the Red Sea. Again, we have evidence of obsidian trade from the Horn of Africa upwards towards Egyptian civilization. So perhaps there were old networks via which these crops were passed from Africa to India, and perhaps other commodities were passed on from India to Africa. There is an intriguing find in Egypt of mango wood, or wood from the mango tree, and that might have been transported to Africa perhaps via relay trade, or who knows, perhaps by some enterprising merchant. We know that from around this time, there was an expansion into the Western Indian Ocean from the Eastern Indian Ocean by Austronesians who settled in Madagascar. So perhaps there were wider maritime networks which future archaeology, especially underwater archaeology in these zones, might give us more insight into. Again, this is an emerging picture. There is a lot more that we need before we can move from conjecture to perhaps more solid evidence. And finally, let's move to the South Indian Neolithic. And here again, we have evidence for the settlement of some sites going back to 3000 BC, but more solid evidence from around 2200 BC and 1900 BC. Now, in the earlier phases of settlement, there might have been what you might call an animal economy in these regions, as you find a lot of evidence for pastoralists who were perhaps domesticating wild animals, and we also find some evidence that the zebu cattle was already present here. But then from about 2000 BC or 1900 BC, you begin to get more solid evidence for agriculture. And again, interestingly, we find barley and wheat, which perhaps came from the north, but we also find evidence for the cultivation of African crops such as pearl millet, in addition to other crops derived from the Eastern Neolithic, such as various pulses, and perhaps also vegetables from other regions of India, perhaps deeper into India, which were being brought out into these outer centers of cultivation. So this gives us a broad overview, and we see that Neolithic civilization was developing all across the Indian subcontinent, but there were phases in which integration between these different zones began to occur. And the most important phase here, of course, is around 2000 BC, when the Harappan civilization began to go into a decline, and we see wider interaction, wider exchanges of crops and perhaps people, and even cultural elements between all these zones intensifying. And of course, there is the added element of outside connections. We spoke about a northern connection perhaps with the Sino-Tibetan arc occurring from Kashmir in the northern Neolithic. We spoke about a possible Gangetic Valley and Southeast Asian connection in the middle arc, and we spoke about a possible Austronesian connection in creating a sea bridge in a sense, or bringing crops from Africa into India and perhaps Indian commodities into Africa. And perhaps this Austronesian arc linked up with older maritime networks, which were vestiges of the old world system in which Harappan merchants and merchants from Western India sailed to the Persian Gulf and perhaps also increasingly towards the Red Sea. So this gives us a broad overview. What are the implications of this? We'll discuss that in a future presentation, in which we discuss how these early formations created the bedrock in which later Indian regions would develop. And later, as people began to move more across not just South Asia, but across the wider Eurasian arc, the southern Eurasian arc, perhaps also the central Eurasian arc, how these different zones became magnetic centers which attracted people towards them who settled here and created new cultural forms, leading to the development of regions in South Asia, which later became the fabric, in a sense, in which different cultural identities began to form.